This podcast is for educational purposes only, does not constitute legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you need legal assistance about a legal problem, contact an attorney.
Welcome back to Know Your Regulator, the podcast that inspires you to engage. I am your host, Simone Murphy, and today we're digging into Senate Bill 14, also known as the Texas Doge Bill, a newly signed law that will fundamentally shift how regulatory agencies in Texas operate. If you hold a professional license from healthcare to trades to financial services, you'll want to hear how this law can affect the rules that govern your license and even how disputes and enforcement actions are handled in the future. I'm joined today by attorneys from the Bertolino law firm, all experts in administrative law and professional license defense. So we'll get into it. Let's start at the beginning. SB 14, or the Texas Doge Bill, was just signed into law. Can you walk us through the goal of this legislation, what sparked it, and what exactly it creates?
Sure, I can jump in first. I think most people are probably familiar with the federal version of this, that's been kind of in the news in the last few months. And so a lot of states, it seemed to have been starting to either create legislation like this or committees like this based on the federal conduct that was going on. And so at this point, it looks like, this is supposed to streamline efficiency, kind of like the federal version. I read, Governor Abbott said it's supposed to check the growth on the administrative state, really trying to continue to safeguard and promote the idea that Texas is this business forward state. So I think the main goal, at least from what we've been seeing from those that were proponents of it, and then from the governor, is that this is what's going to protect Texas businesses and prevent, this unnecessarily unneeded regulation surrounding that.
It's certainly got a lot of connection to all of the federal Doge efforts you see in the news, but it's also a long-standing political theme. I mean, it's not something new that state legislators and the governor's office have only recently started talking about. I mean, you can go back in time and look at things like the Tea Party movement. You can see the governor's office created several years ago a division in their office to address regulatory rules. There's been periodic Sunset Commission reviews of things. So a lot of these, this is just maybe the more recent version of addressing some of these issues, because it's current in the news, but it's certainly got a history that goes back many, many years.
Yeah. Are there any other laws or policies that are in place that can kind of relate to this bill?
I think one that the viewers may be familiar with is the sunset review process. Remember, this bill is focused on the governor's office, and it's creating this efficiency office within the governor's office. But remember that we've got three co-equal branches, and the legislature has a sunset advisory commission made up of legislators and public members, and they review state agencies every 12 years, including their rulemaking authority and the rules that they have in place. So that's at least one way, from a more legislative centric perspective, that efficiency is looked at and changes are proposed.
Interesting. Good to know. Do you know how how this Doge bill and Sunset might interact with each other in the future?
Well, at this point, I think they are kind of separate focuses. The Doge bill is focused more on what the governor's office can do. It has some provisions that talk about the court's role, but I think it's kind of housed in the governor's office. And so I think that that's, very different from the sunset review process, which is kind of a legislatively oriented process. But you never know what may happen down the road as things progress. I think it will be very interesting to see how this public policy pronouncement manifests itself, as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this new office is not just reviewing rules, it's potentially reshaping how entire agencies function. What kind of impact might that have for state agencies that regulate license holders?
Of course, I think a reshaping is occurring, and a plethora of things may happen. One, with the consolidation of government, and this is what a Texas Doge will do, it will essentially shrink the government in the regulatory landscape. Therefore, if you have a license or if you have anything pending before any of these boards, it may slow down the process. Also, too, we do have the Code Construction Act. If you have any rights that are afforded to you under any previous rules, and with the changing of the rules, then that also may further slow down the process because it has to be evaluated which rules may apply to a particular process for a particular license holder. So moving forward, we will definitely see a definitely slow down in the process with various boards.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. And what could this mean for an agency's ability to respond to like an emerging situation like the teacher scandal? How could that affect TEA's ability to respond to something like that?
Well, with those types of issues, because they'll be so high on the list because the boards are there to protect the public, I think they will still have an avenue to do that. But when it comes to everyday processes for license holders, submitting applications, and other types of things that need to be handled before the board, those processes may definitely experience a slowdown.
Gotcha. Okay, okay. And like things like being docketed, kind of things like that, like throughout basically anything kind of touching a license holder, you're saying could be potentially slowed down by this.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Well, when you guys are defending licenses, we know that rules are everything. So how could SB 14 affect those licensees who are currently under investigation or for those who are trying to stay compliant?
So what I would say, Simone, to that is the bill does clarify near the end that, and this is very typical for legislation, that if you already have something that's happened in the past that's currently being evaluated, a complaint, some kind of disciplinary thing, that's going to be covered under the old law. So you're not going to have to worry about, you're in the middle of a complaint investigation and suddenly they're changing the rules on you. This is going to apply to rules that get proposed and approved and adopted going forward. It's kind of looking prospective and not going to be applied retroactively. And that's generally the rule when legislation gets passed, unless there's very specific language, you generally view it as prospective moving forward.
That's good. That's really good for our license holders to know. For those who are trying to stay compliant, could we see a potential gray area where, people might be caught without proper guidance?
Well, I don't think, Simone, that's too likely. I mean, the gist of this Doge bill is really trying to go through the regulatory process and find where there's room for efficiencies, where maybe there's too much red tape or too many requirements, things that hopefully are not substantive, right? Because the legislature passes the bills, the actual laws that substantively address consumer protection and license holder obligations. What this bill is really focused on is, hey, how do we do that efficiently? If there are things that extra steps that don't need to be done, if there's red tape, extra um, applications or forms that have to be filled out, the goal is to try and make things more efficient. And there's always room for efficiency and growth. I mean, with such a large government and so many wide varieties of processes governing everything, pretty much under the sun, every type of profession, occupation, or even industries, there's definitely things I think we're going to find over time that can be done better, more efficiently, and with less red tape. So that's what I think really the gist of the focus of the bill is.
So we kind of were talking about it a little bit before this episode. One of those the biggest pieces of SB 14 is about the courts no longer having to defer to agencies' interpretations of their own rules. Can one of you break that down for us? What does that really mean?
I'll take that. I think that this is probably one of the most significant changes in the law. And what this is called is what's called judicial deference. And historically, what Texas courts have done is they've deferred to the state occupational licensing board's interpretation of the law rather than decide the meaning of the laws on their own. And the historical or the policy reason behind that was the belief that judges lacked the knowledge to interpret these technical language that's in the statutes, and that the agencies are better suited to do that rather than a judge. And again, historically, what it did is it allowed these government agencies that do the interpreting, it almost always in a way that favored the agency's own interests. So what it did is really created a systemic bias that favored the government going into a lot of these cases. And now with this new change in the law, judicial deference is basically no longer current law. Now the judges can do the interpretation, and what it does now is it explains how this affects the judicial review, and what it does is in many ways it empowers the licensees and gives them more power, and that's a huge change.
Yeah, absolutely. And would you guys say that this maybe we will see more appeals and more challenges in court? And what are some of the things that license holders should look out for with this big change?
I mean, absolutely could. I mean, what it does is it creates the new opportunities for these license holders to challenge these regulations in court. Really, it begins to level the playing field a little bit more. You've already had these agencies that have advantages going into appeals, like, there's the standard of review, for instance, the agency's decisions, in order to overturn them, you often had to challenge the standard review of what's called substantial evidence and whether it was arbitrary, capricious, or an abuse of discretion. And those are kinds of advantages that these agencies have, particularly on appeal. So what this has done is, levels the playing field a little bit more. It allows the license holders to pursue their cases and have better defenses and better arguments to be made.
Completely agree with Tony. I think it does level the playing field. We saw in recent years at the federal level, the U.S. Supreme Court has reversed this same concept in the federal system and said, no, we're not going to defer to an agency's interpretation of the laws they're responsible for in their regulatory sphere. And so what you saw in Texas for many years was a decision from the Texas Supreme Court. It's called Texas Citizens. And again, it kind of gave that advantage to state agencies. And so as long as the state agency's interpretation was reasonable and was based, wasn't contrary to the plain language, then it was difficult for a license holder when directly competing with the agency making legal arguments to say, no, judge, you ought to follow our interpretation, because there was a whole series of cases, including Texas Citizens, that said, no, judge, you need to defer to the state agency because there's the experts on this. So to Tony's point, I really think it is going to revolutionize the landscape in terms of, hey, we're on a level playing field. Both the regulated and the regulatory agency can bring legal arguments to the judge, but at the end of the day, they're on equal footing and the judge is going to make the decision.
Yeah, no, it really sounds like it's has the potential to kind of shake things up. Well, to wrap up, guys, I'd love to hear just one piece of advice from each of you. What are something that license holders can do today to prepare for these changes coming with the Doge bill?
I think that it's important that, if you are a license holder and you're, listening or watching this podcast, is that you really educate yourself very well in this new change. and have a good understanding of what this bill does and how it could potentially impact your livelihood and your career and your work. And coupled with that, I also advise that, if you are in a place where, or a position in your life where you've received a complaint notice of some sort and you're facing an investigation, and that could ultimately end up in a court, make sure that you're hiring the right lawyer and, you're finding attorneys that have experience in this area, that have knowledge in this new change in the law. As we mentioned before, this significant change in judicial deference, these are important parts of this law that an experienced lawyer will be able to use and in many ways use to your advantage in defending you.
Yeah, Simone, to piggyback off what Tony says, my takeaway from this is twofold. And in a word, I would say it's opportunity. There's two opportunities here this bill presents. One is license holders may have new, more aggressive legal arguments because they're on equal footing with the agency when it comes to interpreting the laws because of this change. The second is the opportunity that we preach every day here in the Know Your Regulator podcast is to engage with your regulator. This bill basically gives you a whole nother avenue to approach the regulatory world, talk to the governor's office, get involved, make suggestions about how your industry could be more efficient, more streamlined. Maybe you have an idea or a suggestion about something that needs to change. This is, in a way, the government, the legislature, and Governor Abbott saying, hey, we want to hear from you. And so I would say opportunity, those are the two big opportunities to take away from this bill.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Troy. This is a huge opportunity to get involved with your government and be the face of your industry and really effect change when these rules are being made and legislation is being passed. So definitely use it as an opportunity to get involved.
Yeah, I would echo what everybody says, and I would say to like listeners out there, if they maybe had applied for a license in the past or there were certain issues that had come up or certain legal problems, like Troy said, this might be your opportunity to try again, So if you had issues before, now, like we've said, this might actually benefit the people as opposed to the agencies. And so it is important to kind of stay abreast of what's going on and what this, Doge is doing. And then if you think that you would like to, try again in a different field or try, to obtain a license, certainly reach out to a lawyer that's going to be able to like navigate that, better than you may be able to.
I think that's a great point Carrie just made because with these changes, it may open up access to individuals they may want to obtain a license that didn't have that access before. So definitely just educate yourself, like Mr. Bertolino said, get involved and take advantage of the opportunities that this may present.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, there's definitely still a lot to see about how SB 14 will really play out, but it's definitely clear that big change is coming. In license holders, you do not want to be caught off guard. Thank you to our wonderful attorneys for joining us, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in and listening to Know Your Regulator. If you found this helpful, be sure to follow, subscribe, share with your colleagues. Until next time, stay inspired and continue engaging with your regulator.
Know Your Regulator, the podcast that inspires you to engage.